It's an honour to address you today on behalf of the ACP LDC Sugarcane Industries Group on the subject of the European Union's sustainability demands and the EU Green Deal. It's a particular honour to be part of Africa's premier event amongst such high-level sugar and ethanol industry leaders to discuss regulation and government policy. I'm sorry that my presentation to you is in virtual format, but I'll be available after my presentation via the magic of Zoom to address any questions you may have, if you have any. About 250 years ago, William Pitt, the elder, stood up and in his resonant voice commanded the British House of Commons to turn its attention to a highly controversial aspect of government policy with the immortal words, "Sugar, Mr. Speaker." In 18 months from now, those of you who may be lucky enough to secure an invitation to the Sugar Association of London's Sugar Dinner to be held at Guildhall on Thursday the 8th of October 2026 may notice an imposing monument to William Pitt the Elder, Prime Minister of Great Britain from 1766 to 1768, and after whom the city of Pittsburgh in America is named, a monument packed with symbolism and allegory which you might contemplate as you enjoy the fine food and wine and company at the dinner next year. Sugar, dear colleagues, remains a fulcrum of debate about today's divisive controversies. I like to think that William Pitt would celebrate the socio-economic progress that has been made since his time in the 18th century, albeit the progress has been far too inadequate so far. Substantial progress has nevertheless been made thanks to sugarcane in agriculture and industries in African, Caribbean and Pacific and least developed countries, and thanks to the international trade in sugar, bringing buyers and sellers together for hopefully profitable enterprise. And sugar has lost none of its potential sustainability to continue to improve the lives of millions of people in Africa who depend on African sugar industries. My task in the next few minutes is to explore how sugar industries in Africa might exploit the EU's various sustainability initiatives, including but not limited to the Green Deal. At first sight, the EU's sustainability initiatives are a bewildering alphabet of acronyms and impenetrable jargon. The importance of robust mechanisms for collaboration between government and industry with a view to aligning regulations and policies towards certain desirable goals, notably the UN Sustainability Development Goals, has long been recognised. But what do the acronyms of this alphabet soup actually mean? Do these initiatives apply to African sugar, and if so, how and when? And how can sugar industries and peoples of Africa exploit these well-meaning European initiatives? Perhaps the most eye-catching of the European Union's initiatives is the Global Gateway, under which the EU seeks to mobilise up to 300 billion euros of investments for sustainable and high-quality projects across the world. The so-called inaugural milestone of the Global Gateway was the Africa-Europe Investment Package agreed at the African Union EU Summit of February 2022. The investment package for Africa seeks to mobilise approximately 150 billion euros of blended finance, public-private finance, dedicated to bolstering cooperation with African partners in infrastructure, digitalisation, clean energy, sustainable growth, the creation of new jobs, and the improvement of healthcare systems and education, and in support of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA. The European Fund for Sustainable Development Plus, EFSD Plus, is one of the financing goals of the Global Gateway, and it seeks to promote sustainable investments in EU partner countries, potentially including African sugar industries. It offers a variety of risk-sharing instruments of up to 40 billion euros and aims to mobilise up to 135 billion euros of public and private financing to help partner countries achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The Global Gateway Initiative has not been without controversy, including the privatisation of infrastructure and public services in the energy sector risks increasing the debt burden of heavily indebted poor countries, and the lack of publicly available, accessible information on projects financing, tendering processes, awarded contracts, and independent and transparent financial, human rights, and environmental assessments. But in Brussels, the Organisation of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, OACPS, has undertaken dialogue with ACP business fora aimed to share best practices and chart a path for private sector development in OACPS countries. And meanwhile, at a time of rising global tension and unilateralism, the EU has been keen to affirm the principle of mutual benefit. In other words, the EU does not seek asymmetric relationships between Africa and Europe. Now, how might African sugar industries attract investment and promote sustainability? At a meeting in Brussels in November last year, the ACP LDC Sugarcane Industries Group was advised by the European Commission that the following activities may assist. 1. Provide mapping data. We're advised to undertake a mapping exercise to gather data on livelihoods, poverty alleviation, migration, youth employment, socio-economic indicators, energy generation, rural-urban connectivity, and sustainability metrics related to the sugar industries in ACP and LDC countries. 2. Develop a list of investment projects. We're encouraged to compile a list of specific investment projects requiring funding, particularly those focusing on sustainable energy, research and development, and feasibility studies. And a very good example would be the National Biomass Framework in Mauritius, which aims to exploit bagasse, cane trash, and other biomass to generate electricity. Engage in consultations. We're encouraged to participate in ongoing official consultations in Brussels and in London to raise awareness of the sugar industry's needs and leverage the Global Gateway Initiative. It was suggested that the ACP and LDC sugar industries must work with local EU delegations in their respective countries to access funding through the Global Gateway Initiative and hold an EU ACP sugar investment seminar. It was suggested that a standalone EU ACP sugar investment seminar could help navigate the system and help to grapple with and ungrapple the mechanics of the Global Gateway, to present our mapping data and project ideas, and to discuss specific themes particular to the sugarcane industry. And tell our story. The ACP sugarcane industries are urged to tell our story, to raise our visibility in key fora such as the European Parliament, and collaborate locally and regionally. The Commission advises leveraging support mechanisms from bodies like the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat and the East African Community to bolster investment efforts and align with sustainability goals. Lastly, we're advised to note that projects which support EU sustainability initiatives are more likely to be eligible for funding under the Global Gateway. For for example, low carbon energy or bioeconomy initiatives. Of course, the Global Gateway is not the only initiative with which the African sugar industries may have to grapple with, especially those which may wish to export to the EU. And the list of EU initiatives which are already affecting the operations of African sugar industries and/or which may do so in the future is a long one, and it includes globalization and the proliferation of new FTAs. ACP and LDC sugar industries have suffered to a huge degree from preference erosion, which I'll shortly demonstrate. European regulations aimed at decarbonisation, including cogeneration of electricity and the production of biofuels, including sustainable aviation fuel, SAF. Labour issues, such as the requirement to eradicate child labour and modern slavery, and probably a requirement to engage with the EU's deforestation regulation, and the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, of which more later, and food safety and traceability initiatives, for example, HACCP, the BRC standards, etc. And regulations limiting the use of plant protection products and insecticides, etc. And the mirror clauses, a hotly contested issue, gaining increasing support of EU sugar producers groups, as EU regulations limit the competitivity of EU agricultural industries vis-à-vis imports of competing products. And agricultural subsidies, such as coupled income support, presently supporting around 3 million tonnes of EU sugar production with 180 million euros per annum to sugar beet farmers who might otherwise grow something else were it not for this support, and much else besides. I've only a little time to focus very briefly on two aspects, the CSDDD and on SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel. First, let's look at the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. These are two directives which will initially only impact large African sugar industries if they generate over 450 million euros per annum in EU turnover or are parent companies of groups meeting this threshold. But the directives will later apply to companies with over 5,000 employees worldwide and or 1.5 billion euros of global turnover, not only EU turnover. The CSDDD will oblige companies to identify, prevent, mitigate and address adverse human rights and environmental impacts across their operations, their subsidiaries, global value chains, including upstream suppliers and, to a lesser extent, downstream partners, who must provide contractual assurances to ensure compliance with EU sustainability standards. And this includes mandatory compliance with the Paris Climate Accord, the UN agreement designed to limit calculated CO2 emissions and to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. Thus, the CSDDD will extend EU sustainability requirements extraterritorially, influencing third country industries directly and through global value chains. On 26 February 2025, the European Commission adopted a proposal known as the Omnibus Package to postpone application of the CSRD by 1 or 2 years, depending on the size of the company, and to postpone application of the CSDDD by 1 year to 2028. As well as delay, there's been some international pushback against the CSDDD. For example, on the 12th of March 2025, the Protect USA Act was introduced by Senator Bill Hagerty, Republican Tennessee, which aims to counter the EU's CSDDD by blocking its ideologically motivated mandates from affecting US companies' supply chains. Now, sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, has been identified as a promising area of diversification for sugar industries worldwide, with global demand for SAF estimated to be 500 million tonnes per annum by 2050. In the UK, 10% of all jet fuel in flights taking off from the UK must come from sustainable sources by 2030 and 22% by 2040 by law. In the EU, the Refuel EU regulation demands a minimum share of 70% of SAF in all airports by 2050, of which a minimum of 35% must be made up of synthetic aviation fuels. But there's widespread criticism that growing crops to fuel aircraft is ecologically, economically, and thermodynamically illogical because SAF generates little energy above that which is used in its manufacture, no matter whether produced by hydro-treated esters and fatty acids, HEFA, or alcohol to jet, or indeed via the Fischer-Tropsch or power-to-liquid technologies, the latter of which do not rely on agricultural feedstocks. Current EU and UK regulations legally restrict the use of food crops to produce SAF. As things stand today, only food waste products, such as used cooking oil or potentially green hydrogen, may be used to make SAF. And also, by the way, the production of biogas from sugar beet pulp is similarly not allowed by law, restricting the EU and UK sugar beet processing industries' efforts to decarbonise their production. However, similar food versus fuel restrictions are not in place in Brazil, India, nor in the United States of America, and nor, I believe, in many African sugar-producing countries. The EU imports about 18 million hectolitres of pure alcohol, mainly from the USA, Brazil and Pakistan, or about 30% of total EU consumption, a proportion which is growing rapidly. And hence, given current legislation, we may note that the EU and UK may indeed offer promising markets for SAF produced in African sugarcane industries, albeit requiring critical government and supranational support. By the way, detailed data on UK and EU ethanol imports and exports may be attained via Trade Data Monitor LLC. So, to conclude, it's clear that governments worldwide are major influences on global, regional and local sugar markets. One need only look at the influence of the policies of the governments of the United States of America and, in a different way, of India on the ups and downs of the New York No. 11 sugar futures market, as well as on the price of sugar in domestic markets, to see the power of these political influences in terms of both outright market levels and market volatility. These geopolitical risks are ever present and indeed growing, unfortunately, in many cases. What we should all demand is respect for the principle of policy coherence for development. In other words, to ensure that all policies, both internal and external, contribute to the socio-economic development goals of African sugar industries, particularly in the context of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Hence, policies must cohere to support project finance for renewable energy from sugarcane, for the development of high-value sugar and sugar-containing products originating in Africa, for transport and freight, for cane biomass, for connections from sugar mills to the electricity grid, for research and development, including new cane breeding techniques, and to make green trade with the EU and UK financially attractive for the long term, and much else besides. But above all, there can be no sustainability without financial viability. Against the background of sometimes incoherent government policies and incoherent consumer demands, African sugar industries face considerable headwinds in the global and European sugar markets. During the past 6 months, global sugar prices have fallen from more than 23 cents a pound to less than 19 cents a pound, basis ICE number 11 spot market sugar futures FOB at 96 degrees Pel. Given favourable weather in Brazil, India and Thailand, the outlook appears to be that global sugar prices will remain in the range of 18 to 21 cents a pound for the rest of 2025, although we should brace ourselves for continuing volatility. Strategic flexibility, securing supply chains amid trade flow changes, and hedging price risks will be key to thriving in this unpredictable market. And meanwhile, in the domestic EU and UK sugar markets during the past 12 months, spot market prices have fallen from around €1,000 a tonne ex-works in bulk or big bags, or around €850 a tonne based on the European Commission's monthly assessments, to around €550 a tonne today, despite higher costs of production, energy and distribution. And even despite lower EU and UK planted areas, estimated to be down 7% this spring, stocks of sugar held at the EU and UK sugar factories still remain stubbornly high, and there are increasing volumes of so-called IPR sugar, which have rather shockingly all but excluded ACP and LDC bulk raw sugar for refining from EU countries since September 2024. And meanwhile, there's a looming threat of increasing volumes of sugar imported from war-torn Ukraine, and the threat of increasing imports under new free trade agreements with Mercosur, India, Thailand and Australia, which are at various stages of negotiation behind closed doors in Brussels. So the market outlook for African sugar exports is therefore rather challenging, particularly in the UK and EU sugar markets. But on a brighter note, the market for direct consumption specialty raw cane sugars in the EU and UK seems to be, from the available data, relatively resilient despite these global and European headwinds. And further details are available on request. Also, on a brighter note, African sugar industries have relatively good markets on their doorsteps in local and regional markets, as may be seen from recent trade data compiled by Trade Data Monitor, LLC. Now, if I may, I'd like to end with a brief description of the ACP LDC Sugar Cane Industries Group, and to encourage those African sugar industries which may not yet be members of the group to join us in defence primarily of ACP and LDC preferences in the EU and UK sugar markets, remembering that there's no sustainability without financial viability. The ACP Sugarcane Industries Group has a long history, beginning with the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement, the Lomé Convention, the ACP EU Sugar Protocol, the Everything But Arms Initiative, the Cotonou Partnership Agreement and the Samoa Agreement. And the group is widely recognised, including by the European Commission and the UK government, as the representative of ACP and LDC sugar industries, both sugarcane growers and millers. Membership is open to all sugar industries in countries which are eligible to supply preferential sugar under the ACP Economic Partnership Agreements and with the EU and the UK, and/or is a beneficiary of the GSP EBA initiative and/or the UK special DCTS arrangement for least developed countries. The annual membership fee is £1,500 for the 25-26 year. So please join us, and together we can plot a path to financial and environmental sustainability. So finally, I'd like to thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and if you have any questions, please let me know. You have my details, and I look forward to seeing you in the very near future.